Hi, Mick McQuaid here to talk to you about typography. And typography is a big subject. It's a major here, for example, at Rochester Institute of Technology where I'm teaching. And there's a lot that can be said about it. What can I say in just a very, very short blurb like this? Um, a lot of people, when they're faced with that problem, will give you very decisive advice. For example, and I'm quoting from a book on writing for the web, uh, only use sans serif typefaces. Um, what's another one? Set your type ragged right. Um, oh, one of my favorites. Don't use Comic Sans. So these kinds of hilarious pieces of advice are really banal and not really very helpful to you. Um, but the people who give these kinds of advice are not idiots. They have in mind that you don't have much time to practice typography. You're interested in the content that you're producing, not so much in the container that it rides around in. And so they give you what I would call emergency room typography. That is, enough typography to keep the patient alive until a specialist comes along to treat the core of the problem. So try to ignore them. That's not the kind of advice that you'll get from a real typographer, which I'm not. I'm not going to pretend to be schooled in typography. I'm an amateur typographer at best. And it's not the kind of advice that I'm used to getting from serious typographers, so let's put it that way. So what can I tell you about typography? Well, I wish that you would read a couple of books, maybe wishful thinking. So there are a couple of books that I like. One is called The Elements of Typographic Style by Robert Bringhurst from 2004. Another one is by Richard Rutter from 2017 called Web Typography. So I would love it if you would read those books on typography. And look at some websites. So one website that I like is Richard Rutter's webtypography.net. Another one is called ikern.com. That's ikern.com. And there are plenty of others. There are plenty of good websites, and then there are also some with really questionable advice. And there's only one way that you can tell the difference between good advice and questionable advice, in my mind, and that is you you don't have that much time to practice typography, but you have plenty of time to consume typography. You're consuming typography all the time, so you can sharpen your eye. And that's the same advice that I give you about color, is sharpen your eye. The same advice that I give you about color, I want to give you about typography. Sharpen your eye. That's what you can do. Now, if you read some of these books, um, particularly Bringhurst's book, let me say what I think is the most important message that you can take away from them. The most important message I think that you can take away from Bringhurst is that typography should serve the content. That typography is a servant of the content. That's not the same thing as saying that the typography is invisible. Typography is visible and is on display all the time, but it's there to serve the content, not to dominate the content. And Bringhurst gives a lot of examples of how this is so. One example that caught my eye was he said that you wouldn't set a 19th century English text in a 17th century French typeface. Now, you may not know the difference between a 19th century blah blah and a 17th century whatever, but you can imagine that to do so makes a point. To do that would make a point that would potentially overshadow the text, would potentially detract from the text and draw attention to the typographer making a point to those who have sharp enough eyes to see what's going on. So don't try to make points. Try instead to support the content. Now there are two problems with not knowing the difference between a 19th century English text and a 17th century French font. And one of those problems is that it's an opportunity to sharpen your eye. So when you find out about stuff like that, sharpen your eye. There is an opportunity in Bringhurst's book to do that. I'll mention that in a couple of minutes. The other one is that type is referential. So type is an art and a craft of its time, and it carries messages that are embedded in their time, and so it's sensitive to the content of its time, and that's an important fact to know. Typography is changing all the time. It's been changing in adaptation to new technologies for the last half millennium, but it's also changing with respect to ideas that people have about reading and writing. And so that may explain why the type of one century doesn't belong with the, in one place, doesn't belong with the text of another century in another place. So some typography expresses an affinity to handwriting. Some typography pays homage to handwriting, particularly near the dawn of typography. That was more the case. But to some extent, it's even the case today. In fact, in some ways, the digital revolution has made it easy to pay homage to handwriting with typography. Another kind of typeface takes advantage of the technology of its era, and I'm thinking in particular of Bodoni, a typeface that has very thin strokes and very, very thick strokes that stress out the machinery and challenge the machinery, the ink, and the paper of its era. There's other typeface examples that degrade gracefully. So they take into account the friction of the technology, the wear and tear of the technology of their era, and they degrade slowly and gracefully so that the pieces of metal that form the type are still useful years after they were new and sharp. At the heart of typography are letter forms and series of letter forms. And these series of letter forms have a couple of characteristics that are central. One is called legibility. Legibility is the extent to which you can distinguish between two letter forms. The extent to which you can distinguish between two letter forms is called legibility. Now, another quality is called readability, and that is the extent to which you can pass over a series of letter forms smoothly and easily. And those two concepts, legibility and readability, are sometimes in conflict. And let me give you a kind of an oversimplified example of how that is so. So imagine a lowercase letter r in a sans serif typeface, and imagine a lowercase letter n in a sans serif typeface, and imagine them getting closer and closer together. The farther they are apart, the more legible they are, that is, the more they can be distinguished from each other. As they get very close together, they become indistinguishable from a lowercase m, but they become more readable in the sense that the two little humps, which are called apertures or counters, come together and form a rhythm. And so it's easier to pass over them when they become illegible. So you have to strike a balance between legibility and readability in how far apart you put these two letters. So that's kind of an oversimplified example of how legibility and readability can be in conflict with each other. A compromise is needed. Now, a third characteristic that type has besides legibility and readability is called color. And this is different from the general usage of the word color. Typographic color is how dark or heavy the density of ink is on the page or on the screen for that matter. So you can imagine a page or a screen full of bold-faced text being darker or heavier than a page of light font from the same family. You can imagine a page with high x height, the x height being the distance from the baseline to the top of the lowercase x, the height of the letter lowercase x. A typeface that has a high x height will appear heavier or darker than one that has a smaller x height. If you put in more leading, that is the vertical space between lines, the page will look lighter as opposed to one with less leading that will be darker and heavier, or heavier, I should say. And there are other ways that you can make side bearings of letters. So if you letter fit the letters very loosely, the page will appear lighter and darker if the side bearings are very tight. So typographers try to control the color, the typographic color of a page, very much as they try to control the legibility and readability, although it's of a lower priority than legibility and readability. Now, there are two major sources of knowledge about typography. One is typographers themselves, and that's the source that I'm referring to and that I would like you to refer to. And the other one that I take a little bit less seriously, but I'm always confronted with in class, is a science called reading psychology. So in reading psychology, there are studies of people reading, obviously. Some of those studies concern differences in typography. And those studies are, in my mind, unstable. That is, they're not reproducible. The results from one sample don't match the results from another sample. And I'll give you an example of this. I'm invariably confronted by a student who will say, I read a study that says that, or they won't even say I read a study, they'll just say, of course you know that sans serif type is better than serif type. And then a little conversation draws out that they read a study that said that. So I asked them to Google, whichever they say, sans serif is better or serif is better. I asked them to Google, see if they can find a study that says the reverse. And invariably they can find a study that says the reverse because these results are unstable. So I would like to point you to an article by a prominent reading psychologist, or actually by two people, Kevin Larson and Rosalind Picard, an important computer scientist, in which they talk about the possibility that the human vision system overpowers vagaries of poor typography so much that the studies of different typography are often unstable, are often difficult to reproduce. And instead of studying reading comprehension or something like that, what they do in their article, this article is called The Aesthetics of Reading. I think I neglected to mention that. The Aesthetics of Reading, and it's from 2005, and it's by Kevin Larson and Rosalind Picard. It's very easily available on the web. I've put it on my courses. And in this, they do a study of the perceived time passing. So this is a different measure than what is typically used. They measure, they have the idea, or they inherited the idea actually from another paper, that if you are doing a task that you think is enjoyable, you perceive time passing more rapidly than if you're doing a task that you perceive as unenjoyable. And time seems to drag if you're doing something that's unenjoyable. So they did this study and found decisive results in favor of what are traditionally thought to be good typographic practices. And that might be a valuable measure for future studies. Now, I cannot substitute for actually reading Bringhurst, but I can make a few points about his book. The first one is you should really read the beginning. He starts out with a series of 8 diagrams from 8 periods in typographic history. And he emphasizes different points about those periods, about the differences between those periods. And you can really sharpen your eye by studying those 8 diagrams. So the points that he makes are things like the axis of the pen. He uses the expression pen as tracing the letter, kind of an imaginary pen, tracing the letter forms. The modulation of the stroke, so that's the thickness of the letter, the relative thickness or thinness of the strokes in the letter forms. The style of the serifs and terminals, those are the ends of the letters. The size and shape of the apertures, those are the counters. The apertures or counters are like the middle of a letter O or the middle of a letter P. And the relationship of the italic typeface to the Roman typeface. Is it subsidiary to it, or is it an independent family? Or not a family, it's a member of the family, but is it an independent member of the family? So examining these diagrams will sharpen your eye. That's my point about those. Now, second, Bringhurst uses a lot of examples from different alphabets and different languages. And they're mostly Western, but still there's a lot of variety there. And it helps you to prepare for addressing an international audience, to kind of expand your thinking about typography beyond the customs of American English. Certainly did mine. Okay, and then the third thing is he begins the book with what he calls the grand design. So that's a chapter following those 8 diagrams that you should, kind of the second most important thing that you could read if you have a chance. It gives some very fundamental principles that transcend any technology in fact, the whole book transcends particular technologies. This grand design terminates with a summary of 5 services that he says that you should offer, that typography should offer to the reader. And the 5 services are, it should invite the reader, the typography should invite the reader into the text. The typography should reveal the tenor and meaning of the text. It should clarify the structure and order of the text, so things like headings, for example. It should link the text with other existing materials, so that would include maps and photographs, drawings, other things that are part of the document. And finally, and most important, induce a state of energetic repose, the most ideal condition for reading. So let me just repeat that. Induce a state of energetic repose, the ideal state for reading. So that's something that you can use kind of as a benchmark as you do typography, and think about whether your typographic choices are contributing to providing these 5 services. So I think that's very useful. Now, starting with the second chapter, Bringhurst becomes very technical, and it becomes much more difficult to follow than the first chapter. He, for example, delves into detail about the M, which is spelled EM, and it's a measure of the height of the current typeface, but it's a horizontal measure usually of spacing, and it's a measure that's been around since the dawn of typography and is instantiated in current technology like CSS, but he doesn't ever talk about CSS. He just talks about the M and its use in things like word spacing. So when you set the minimum space between words and the maximum space between words in your typesetting program, you invariably measure it as a fraction of an m. So it's difficult. You should you should realize that the core of the advice that Bringhurst is giving is independent of any particular technology. For example, he suggests that you should use a comfortable measure. So he uses that expression, you should use a comfortable measure. And measure is a typographic term that refers to the length of a line of text measured in number of characters and spaces. And the historical ideal that's just kind of received wisdom from generations of typographers is 66 or thereabouts, and most books and newspapers and magazines hover around in the general vicinity of a measure of 66. And Bringhurst gives a table of letter fitting or copy fitting table of different measures based on the length of a lowercase alphabet in a given typeface and the length of the line in picas. So you probably don't have a pica ruler. I have a pica ruler over here. But still, it's a measure of line length. And the measure of the measure in the sense of the typographic measure is a function of line length and the size of the lowercase alphabet in points. I think that's how the copy fitting table is set up, if I recall correctly. Yeah, it's in points. Okay, so anyway, those are some things that and that's affected by different characteristics. So there are characteristics like the X height I mentioned earlier that will affect the appropriate measure. A larger appropriate measure is available if you have a lower X height or if you have a larger leading, just as examples of things that can affect the measure. Okay, so but to get a more, you probably want a more specific technology focused introduction to typography. So I'm going to suggest that in addition to looking at Bringhurst, you also look at webtypography.net, and that encompasses chapters 2 and 3 of Bringhurst's book entirely with CSS examples. And the table of contents of that website is worthwhile reading, as it's worded as a series of suggestions. So like kern modestly, if at all, is one suggestion. Don't letter space lowercase text without a good reason. And you can just dive into the sections if any of these ideas are unfamiliar to you, and just use the table of contents itself as a refresher. Now, as I mentioned, Rutter wrote a book based on this website, much more extensive book with lots of detail. And in particular, there's a section near the end called "If You Read Nothing Else, Read This." And I really recommend that you read this. So that is similar to the table of contents on the website, a list of suggestions. And you can just flip through that list of suggestions and just dive into the chapters when one is unfamiliar to you. So that's pretty much all I want to say about typography. Now what I'd like to do is suggest an exercise for you to undertake. So this exercise is to construct an HTML document, and this HTML document should have 4 things in it. It should have the lyrics of a song called Hellhound on My Trail, I think that's right, by Robert Johnson. That's a song that Robert Johnson recorded in 1938 or something like that. So I'd like you to have the lyrics to that song, which are easily available on the web. There are loads of websites with the lyrics. And as a special challenge, the different websites that have the lyrics to it use different kinds of line breaks. So you have to choose line breaks in the song. So you may want to actually listen to the song to choose the line breaks. I don't know. That may help you. So the second thing I'd like you to have on this HTML document is a paragraph about the song, or a paragraph about Robert Johnson in general. The third thing is a graphic, a picture of some kind, and it could be a picture of Robert Johnson. It could be, oh, and by the way, the paragraph you can just take from some website and then you just attribute it to the author and give a proper attribution. And the graphic the same way, give a proper attribution. There are a couple of pictures of Robert Johnson available, and pictures of guitars would be appropriate. He was a masterful guitarist, and one of the all-time great guitarists. There are things in the lyrics of the song that might make sense for a graphic, so it can be a drawing or a photograph, some kind of graphic though. And then the last thing I want you to include is a color palette, similar to what you would see on color.adobe.com. So that's a bar of 5 spot colors that work well together, and in this case would work well for a web page devoted to this song. So you have to decide what colors would work together for a more extensive design of a web page about this song. Okay, so I would like you to do that, and that's about it. So thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.